His father's expulsion was inevitable. Until the boy left the court in shock. In a modest part of the city, where the narrow streets and decrepit buildings seemed to bear witness to past struggles, a family lived under the weight of social injustices. The father, Albert, a man marked by years of struggle against poverty and racial discrimination, had devoted his entire life to providing a roof over his head and an education for his children. But despite his efforts, he felt overwhelmed by the burden of injustice that seemed to crush his existence. Albert had always believed that he could, somehow, protect his children from a world that had more harm in store for them than good. Yet, over the years, his body tired from years of hard work and his dreams crushed by the realities of society seemed to tell him otherwise. He had sacrificed his youth, his health, and his aspirations to provide for his family. But the injustices were persistent, and his youthful mistakes, which he had always sought to repair, had come to haunt him. His cherished job as a carpenter was taken away from him after a violent argument with a racist boss, who wrongly accused him of negligence. Unemployment, then illness, fell on him like a curse. In the midst of this whirlwind, one of his sons, Yannick, a 17-year-old teenager, grew up in the shadow of his father's silent sacrifices. Yannick had never had a carefree childhood. He had seen his father work tirelessly, his body deteriorating, his mind tiring, but he had never seen the recognition he deserved. Unlike his father, Yannick did not believe in submission. His mind was sharp, but his anger, fueled by the frustrations accumulated over the years, had transformed into a revolt that boiled under his skin. He refused to see his father, a man who had given so much, end up in oblivion, broken by a system that made no room for people like them. Yannick dreamed of change, but not at any cost. His dreams were mainly driven by the frustration of seeing his father collapse under the weight of injustice, while the guilty ones strutted in the streets without consequence. He could not accept this reality. He dreamed of revolution, not only for his family, but for the entire community which lived in the same precariousness, subjected to the same humiliations. But Yannick's revolt was not blind. It was a cry of defiance against injustice, a desire to prove that those who had been crushed by the system could still rise again. Albert, although loving and protective, had become a fragile, helpless figure. His dreams had crumbled over time, and he had become the reflection of a generation crushed by racial and economic injustice. He had lost his job, and the family was on the verge of becoming homeless. Precariousness had taken over their lives, and the threat of expulsion seemed inevitable. They had already been evicted from several homes, and each move took away a little more dignity. It was an endless spiral that pushed them ever deeper into the abyss of social indifference. This is where everything changed. One day, Yannick had had enough. He had seen his father go before the judge, hoping for clemency that would never come. He had seen his father's tired face, his downcast eyes, overwhelmed by humiliation and helplessness. Albert had tried to convince a judge, an emotionless man, that the family situation was not the result of his negligence but of circumstances beyond his control. But Yannick, revolted by the indifference of the system, decided that it was time to act. He knew that his father had already lost his dignity in the courts, that his image as an honest worker no longer mattered, crushed by decades of prejudice and neglect. But Yannick was not ready to accept that this humility was his father's only destiny. He wanted this humility to be a catalyst, a driving force for something bigger, stronger. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he had to do something. The world had to know that there was a price for indifference, a price for oppression. On the day of the trial, Yannick appeared in court alone. He was nervous, sure, but he had something more about him. A deep conviction, an energy that had been burning within him for months, years. He wasn't just a child defending his father, he was a young man who was tired of submission, of fear, of silence. He had a crazy but convincing idea in mind. He wanted to defend his father not as a lawyer, not with words cloaked in formalism and politics, but as a son ready to challenge the system. A son determined to demand justice where there was none. The court was silent, a large, austere and impersonal room where justice seemed to be decided by numbers and signatures. The judge, a cold and emotionless man, listened to Albert's pleading. He spoke slowly, with the fatigue of those who have lost hope of finding a solution to their misfortune. His explanation of his inability to pay his debts due to the loss of his job and his health did not even seem to scratch the surface of the issue. The judge did not react, his gaze fixed on the file he was holding, almost ignoring the suffering of the man in front of him. Albert, like so many others, was a number in a ruthless system. But in the back of the courtroom, something changed. Yannick, until then silent, suddenly raised his hand. The sound of murmurs in the room instantly silenced. A chill of uncertainty ran through the benches, as if there was a sense that what was about to happen would destabilize the fragile balance of the court. All eyes turned to him, a thin, sparse-haired young man with a defiant expression marked on his face. He was not there to plead, nor to beg. He was there to shake up, to disrupt the order of things. "Your Honor," Yannick began, his voice low at first, but growing stronger with each word, "I'm not here to tell a story of poverty. I'm here to show you the truth. My father doesn't need your pity. What he needs is justice. What he needs is for you to stop treating people like objects to be moved around." A murmur ran through the room, like a wave of surprise, disapproval, but also palpable tension. The other side's lawyers, some already wearing condescending smiles, exchanged amused glances. But Yannick was not there to be ridiculed. He knew this moment was not for diplomacy. He was there to make a voice heard that had always been ignored. He stood up abruptly, his movements imbued with new determination. He moved towards the judge's bench, one step after another, each gesture asserting itself with unexpected force. The room seemed to hang on every word. "My father worked hard, too hard," he continued, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "And he was exhausted by a world that only pushed him away, rejected him. He never had a chance, and he never will, as long as people like you decide who deserves to be helped and who should sink into oblivion. You know nothing of the suffering in his eyes. You don't even see the sacrifices he made for us. You only see a file, a number, one case among many others. But I see a man. A man with a story, a man with dreams, a man who deserves more than your indifference." The judge, taken by surprise, seemed to lose control of the situation. He tried to regain his composure, to order Yannick to sit down again, but his words did not reach the young man's soul. Yannick, driven by a dull anger, did not intend to let this happen. His gaze, now piercing, fixed on the judge, but his words were aimed at the entire room. "You want to deport my father, but you have no idea what that means for him," he said, each syllable echoing around the room like a hammer blow. "You don't know what it feels like to lose your home, your dignity, everything you've built up over the years. You don't know what it feels like to see a man fall, a family break up, just because he didn't have the chance to be born into the right world. And it's us, his children, who have to suffer from that." The silence thickens. The emotion in Yannick's voice was palpable, like a war cry in the face of an injustice that he could no longer tolerate. He was tired of seeing his father crushed under decisions made without regard for humanity, tired of seeing the most deprived always crushed under the weight of a system that left them no chance. "But I promise you, this isn't the end," he added, his gaze burning with unwavering determination. "If you fail us today, be prepared to hear from us again and again. We will no longer be invisible. We will be there, and this time, it is you who will have to face our revolt." The silence that followed was heavy, like a thick veil, a layer of tension that no one seemed willing to lift. The murmurs died down little by little, giving way to a heavy weight. Albert, who had always believed that his struggle was lost in advance, felt like a man who had suddenly woken up from a long nightmare. His eyes, fixed on his son, were filled with a trembling, fragile, but nonetheless living pride, a pride he had not felt in years. It was as if Yannick had just offered him a breath of life, a breath of pure air in a world that he thought was suffocating. He never imagined that his son, this young man whom the world considered insignificant, could upset an entire court. Yannick was only a 17-year-old boy, an age where dreams are still imbued with naivety, but also one where one can have the passion and determination to shake things up. Albert now looked at him in a new light, His son was no longer simply a child he had raised in precarious circumstances, but a young man capable of standing up against cruel injustice with the strength of his convictions. The years of struggle and resignation seemed to fade away, replaced by the light of hope that his son had just kindled. Across the room, the other side's lawyers exchanged worried glances. Their condescending smiles were gone, replaced by palpable tension. The judge, too, seemed unsettled, his fingers tapping nervously on his desk, as if he were trying to regain his power, his authority. He was no longer the only one in control of this scene. The room seemed to have transformed into a battlefield where the truth, however simple, had won a victory over years of cold calculations and indifference. The looks of the jurors, until then frozen in a routine of judgment, were now carried away by the impact of Yannick's words. For the first time, it seemed like the scales of justice had tipped in favor of this 17-year-old boy, the one no one ever took seriously. Yannick, with his frail figure and his hoarse voice, had shaken the system. He was not there to claim rights, nor to demand aid. He was there to tell a raw truth, a truth that went beyond laws and numbers, that of human dignity, of the hope that every individual, whatever their status, deserves to be treated with respect. The judge stood slowly, a gesture that betrayed his own hesitation. He withdrew not to deliver an immediate verdict, but to deliberate, to weigh the seriousness of Yannick's words. This moment of uncertainty was both a relief and a torture. The minutes seemed to stretch into infinity, each second weighing on Yannick's shoulders, but he stood straight, firmer than ever. His hands, although sweaty, no longer trembled. A quiet confidence had taken hold of him, a confidence he had never known, as if the act of opposing the system had propelled him into another space-time, a space where he no longer had anything to lose. He was waiting, not in anguish, but in the assurance that what he had said, what he had done, could not be ignored. He was waiting, not for a favorable verdict, but for a sign that his voice had weight, that his call for justice, for humanity, was not in vain. Finally, the judge returned to the room. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. It was no longer oppressive, but charged with feverish anticipation, full of possibilities. The judge, without embellishments or long explanations, pronounced his verdict in a firm voice. This family's case deserves an immediate re-evaluation. The court orders the suspension of the eviction and a review of the circumstances. The words rang out like a clap of thunder. Albert, frozen for a moment in disbelief, felt a warmth rising within him, a warmth he had not known for too long. He slowly turned his head towards Yannick, his eyes clouded with tears. It wasn't just a pause in the expulsion, it was a sign, a change in direction. The court had not only granted a break, it had opened a breach in the system, a breach that Yannick had forced through with unrivaled determination. Albert stood up quickly, his legs weakening with emotion, and he rushed towards his son. He took him in his arms, firmly, as if this gesture could eliminate all the pain accumulated over the years. The tears that flowed from his eyes were the tears of a man who, after being reduced to nothing, had just found something fundamental: dignity. The dignity he thought he had lost forever. In that courtroom that day, it wasn't just a 17-year-old man who made history. He was a young man who, through his courage, through his simple humanity, had shown everyone that justice was not a question of power or age, but of truth. He demonstrated that sometimes the greatest strength lies in conviction and the determination to stand up for what is right.